Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. A group of psychologists conduct research into the impact of music on worldviews. They select students from 3 sixth forms using a random number generator using students' candidate numbers. They are asked to answer a questionnaire about their views on a number of world issues, including climate change. Students record their answer on a Likert scale, recording whether they strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree to the statements given. The students are then exposed to 30 minutes of either heavy metal or reggaeton music via headphones and then asked to repeat the questionnaire. Both the types of music selected were not consistent with their usual music preferences. Students were tested 1 week later using a different range of statements about a number of world issues, including views on gender equality. A worldview score was recorded out of 100 based on an average score between the 2 questionnaires. A higher worldview score showing more positive worldviews and a lower worldview score showing more negative worldviews. Explain why the experimental design chosen in the worldview study was appropriate. 2 marks. We have the command word explain here, requiring us to give some detail and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question, in that we understand what experimental designs are. Experimental designs are what's happening with our participants and how they're allocated between our conditions. The focus of this question is why this experimental design is appropriate. One of our marks is identifying why that particular experimental design is appropriate for this particular study. This means it needs to link back to the worldview study. So this identification mark is actually an AO2 mark. We then need to justify why that is appropriate. So giving that a link back to why this particular design would be appropriate for the aims of this particular piece of research. Let's break down a response. The psychologist selected a repeated measures design to eliminate participant variables about worldviews affecting the validity of the study, as the gender of the participant may have had more of an influence than the music that they had listened to in the study. In our response, we've identified that this is a repeated measures design. We've gone back to our STEM to see why it's a repeated measures design. We've got that all the students were asked one questionnaire on climate change, and then all the students were asked another questionnaire, this time with gender equality statements. Although we've correctly identified that it's a repeated measures design, that's not what our question is asking us to do. We need why this is more appropriate. And we've started to do that by talking about it eliminating participant variables. We've also said the impact of this on our study in that it would affect the validity. However, we've got to have a non-generic response, and here we've selected a particular participant variable in terms of gender that might have more of an influence than the music they listen to. Describe how the psychologist could use counterbalancing in the worldview study. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word describe. This is asking us to give detail and extension to give depth to our response. For our 2 marks, we need 2 separate ways in which we would employ or implement counterbalancing, because we have this describe how question. This is assumed knowledge that we understand what counterbalancing is, and we need to link this back into the worldview study in 2 separate ways to show that we understand the STEM and can apply our knowledge. Because there's a STEM, both of these marks are AO2 marks, meaning that we need to have application within our response 2 separate times. Here's our response. Counterbalancing could be implemented by the psychologist by having some participants completing the questionnaire that includes views on gender equality first, and then the questionnaire that includes climate change. A separate group of participants would have the questionnaires the other way round. Our understanding of counterbalancing is demonstrated in our application of this idea of ABBA, that some participants would have condition A or complete the questionnaire first, and then a different questionnaire second, and a separate group of participants would have this the other way round. We've linked this back into the context of the STEM by saying that some participants would complete the questionnaire on gender equality and then climate change. So we've got two different links into the STEM. The results from the worldview study for the heavy metal music condition are shown in Table 1. Complete Table 1 and calculate the standard deviation for the worldview study to 3 significant figures, 4 marks. Here we have the command words complete and calculate. Here we need to calculate using our calculator and complete the mathematical skills that we've been asked to do in the question. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this study in how we calculate standard deviation as a measure of dispersion. Standard deviation tells us how spread out the scores are around the mean. Our first job is to calculate the mean. This means we need to add up all the scores and then divide it by the number of scores. So we need to add up all the values in the world scores column, and this is all for the heavy music condition. So we're going to do 17 plus 55 plus 61 plus 63 plus 47 plus 18 plus 32 plus 10 plus 71 plus 22. So that equals 396. And then we're going to divide that by the number of scores, which is 10, to give us 96.3. And we're going to divide that by 10 to give us 39.6. So our first mark is to complete this column, x minus the mean. Where we're talking about x, that's our data score. So we're going to do 17 minus 39.6, which equals minus 22.6. And then we're going to do that for each single data score. And then we need to square each of these values in our first column. So we're going to do minus 22.6 squared, and this final column should not have any negative values. And then for our third mark, what we need to do is complete this by doing the sum of that x minus the mean squared column. So we're going to add up this column here with all of our numbers. And that equals 4,504.4. We can then complete the formula that we're given in the front of our booklet, and we do get a mark for writing it out and substituting all the values. So we're going to do the square root of 4,504.4 divided by n, which is 10 minus 1, so that's 9. So we need to do this calculation first before we do our square root, and then that gives us our final answer of 21.2. In some questions, you might just be given the data table, like where it says worldview score, and then I would write in these other two columns so that you know that you've completed all of the skills necessary to do the standard deviation. We have some results in Table 2. Table 2 shows the mean and the standard deviation for the effect of music on worldviews. Heavy metal has a mean of 39.6 and a standard deviation of 21.2. Reggaeton has a mean of 67.8 and a standard deviation of 13.9. Explain one conclusion about the effect of music on worldviews based on the standard deviation of the heavy metal condition shown in Table 2, 2 marks. Our command word here is explain, so we need to give some detail and extension to our response. This question is focused on conclusions. We have 2 marks available for our question, and one of our marks comes from identifying a conclusion. However, this is a STEM question, and so this needs to link in to the specific data that we have been presented with. Our conclusion needs to link back to the worldview study, and we got some more information in our question. We need to be focusing on the standard deviation of the heavy metal condition. We need to justify the conclusion that we have drawn by using specific data from the table. This gives us our second mark, our justification mark. Let's have a look at a model answer. A standard deviation of 21.2 is high, showing that the worldview score in the heavy metal condition is quite spread out, with some participants having much higher or lower scores. So listening to heavy metal music does not consistently produce a negative worldview. The identification of our conclusion is actually at the end, that listening to heavy metal music does not consistently produce a negative worldview. We're using two different parts of the STEM to come to this conclusion. Firstly, we're looking at the mean score and the mean score being lower. Secondly, we've taken this information from the STEM that a lower worldview score means that it's more negative. Therefore, we can say that listening to heavy metal does not consistently produce a negative worldview. We're then going to justify this conclusion using data from the table. We've picked out our standard deviation score of 21.2, and we've interpreted this saying it's a high score, meaning that the results are more spread out. That has an impact, meaning that the heavy metal music isn't the only variable having an impact on our conclusions about negative worldviews. The researchers wanted to see if there was a significant difference in the type of music and the worldview score. They conducted a Wilcoxon t-test and found an observed or calculated value of 14 for a 2.5% level of significance, with a one-tailed test based on the results of 12 participants. Explain what this shows in terms of the effect of type of music on worldviews. 2 marks. This is an explain question, which requires us to give some detail and extension to our response. In this question, we want to know what it shows, and this is some assumed psychological knowledge. We need to return back to our STEM in terms of looking at what this shows. So we need to determine whether there is a significant difference in our response. An identification of whether this shows a significant difference for this particular data set is going to give us one of our marks. By using the data, this is an application skill. Our second piece of application is going to come from the impact of this, i.e., what does that mean in the relationship between our two variables? Our first job is to find our critical value, and we're going to use this information from the STEM. The STEM tells us that we have a one-tailed test, and we're using 2.5 as our level of significance. Therefore, we're going to go down this column in order to determine which value is our correct value. We have a number of participants, or N, is 12, because we have 12 participants. So our critical value is 13. Let's break down a response taking that information of our critical value. The calculated value of 14 is more than the critical value of 13 at the 2.5% level of significance for a one-tailed test, so there was not a significant difference between the type of music affecting the participants' worldview. We've identified our significant value, and we've used all the information from the STEM in order to get that, showing our application skills. We've then determined that this means that our results are not significant, and what that means? Well, that means that the type of music is not affecting the participants' worldview in a causal relationship. A research team are interested in whether belief in the paranormal was affected by culture. A self-selected sample of 10 participants was recruited from a university campus in the UK, Japan, America, and Brazil. They were interviewed about what beliefs they held about the paranormal using a semi-structured interview. All the participants were asked about their beliefs on ghosts, faith healing, and their beliefs on life after death. As part of the interview, the participants were also asked about any other beliefs that they held as an opportunity to gain new insights on paranormal beliefs that the research team might not be aware of. The research team collected quantitative data in the number of beliefs held about pre-existing paranormal beliefs. They also collected qualitative data, recording the responses that the participants gave to the open-ended question about any additional beliefs that the participants had. Explain one strength of collecting qualitative data in the paranormal belief study. 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. The focus of this question is a strength, and so all of our marks need to come from describing a strength. The assumed knowledge in this question is that we understand what qualitative data is. There are 2 marks in this question, and we get 1 mark for identifying a particular strength of qualitative data. Because this is a STEM question, that strength needs to be linked into the paranormal belief study. Therefore, this becomes an AO2 mark. Our second mark is then to justify that, to say why that is a strength for this particular piece of research. Time to have a look at a response. By collecting qualitative data, the research team can access information about the meaning paranormal beliefs have for individuals, increasing the validity as the researchers understand what beliefs are held and why participants have them. We've identified our strength in that our qualitative data gets the meaning behind individual paranormal beliefs. We've justified that by saying that this increases the validity of the study and we understand what beliefs are held and why they are held. Explain how the research team could analyse their qualitative data, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in that we understand what qualitative data is. This is written data, and we can remember that by the L in qualitative. This question is focused on how we're going to analyse that data, or how we're going to break it down in order to draw some findings out and understand this piece of research. As this question has a STEM, we need 2 separate ways or 2 separate ideas for our 2 AO2 marks. Both need to be linked into the context of our STEM in order for us to gain lots of marks for this particular response. Let's have a look at our answer. The research team could create behavioural categories for the additional paranormal beliefs held by the participants. For example, being able to move objects or communicate with dead people. We've demonstrated our understanding of qualitative data analysis by talking about behavioural categories. We've then linked this into the STEM by giving particular paranormal beliefs that we'd be creating those behavioural categories about. We're going to tick this off in our STEM in order to show a variety of application skills. We need a second idea in order to get our second mark. The research team could tally the number of times that behavioural categories appear in the transcriptions of the participants' responses to the question about additional beliefs, to compare them cross-culturally. We've understood that in qualitative data analysis, we need to tally up the times that a particular category appears. We've linked this back into the STEM, not only talking about the response to the open question, but the aim of this piece of research in order to study cross-cultural beliefs. We've returned back to the aim of the study in order to get our second application mark. The researchers in the paranormal belief study decide to use a thematic analysis for their qualitative data rather than a content analysis. Explain 1 strength of using thematic analysis instead of content analysis to analyse the data in this study, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and thoroughness to our response in order to access our marks. There's quite a lot of assumed knowledge in this question, in an understanding of what thematic analysis is and how it is different from content analysis. These are 2 different types of qualitative data analysis, but do have some distinct differences. This question is also focused on a strength, so a lot going on for quite a short mark question. Our first mark comes from identifying a particular strength. However, because this is still a STEM-based question, this needs to link in to this particular study. We get our second mark for justifying why that is a strength. Why is that a benefit for this particular data analysis style? Let's have a look at an answer. As the researchers are looking at additional paranormal beliefs, using a thematic analysis is more appropriate as the categories are created from the data collected and therefore would reflect the beliefs rather than imposing the researchers' categories on the data. This response shows our understanding of thematic analysis and the difference with content analysis, in that the themes or the categories are created from the data after we've collected it, In a content analysis, we can use existing themes to see if they're still apparent in our data. We've clearly shown our AO2 skills here by identifying that this is a part of an additional paranormal beliefs that we're trying to identify, and therefore can only apply to this particular research. And then we've justified why this is beneficial. That it's just going to reflect the beliefs that we're categorising from the study and have gathered from the data, rather than imposing some pre-existing ideas of the researchers. Table 3 shows the mean and standard deviation for the number of paranormal beliefs. The UK has a mean of 6.3 and a standard deviation of 1.06. Japan has a mean of 4.66 and a standard deviation of 5.85. America has a mean of 7.55 and a standard deviation of 5.29. Brazil has a mean of 2.32 and a standard deviation of 9.65. Using Table 3, explain 2 conclusions about the effect of culture on paranormal beliefs, 4 marks. For our command word explain, we need to give a detailed and extended response. This question is looking for conclusions, so outcomes about our particular aim. Given that it's a STEM question, we need to be linking this back to, or our conclusions need to be about, the effect of culture on paranormal beliefs. Given that we need 2 conclusions, we're going to think of this as 2 2-mark questions. For each of our 2 marks then, we get 1 mark for giving a particular applied conclusion. Our second mark comes from justifying why that is a conclusion. We justify by giving findings from our table. Let's have a look at a particular response to this question. Individualistic cultures have more paranormal beliefs, as both the UK and America have a higher mean than Japan, as 6.3 and 7.55 are greater than 4.66. We're starting with the mean score, or the average score. We're giving a particular conclusion, identifying that specific countries have more paranormal beliefs, by comparing different values. We've understood that individualistic cultures, and our examples of those are the UK and America. We're comparing that to different cultures that are collectivist, and our collectivist culture is Japan in our STEM. We've justified this by comparing our values, saying that 6.3 and 7.55 are bigger than 4.66, so that's why we can give this conclusion. You can manipulate the data and explain the difference instead. We're then going to go for a second conclusion. Although Brazil has a lower mean number of paranormal beliefs than all the other countries, this is inconsistent, as the standard deviation of 9.65 is the highest, so some subpopulations may have more paranormal beliefs. Our second conclusion is that some subpopulations within Brazil may have more paranormal beliefs. We've justified that with our figure from the table, talking about 9.65 and the standard deviation. We've understood that standard deviation tells us how spread out that score is around the mean. The fact that Brazil has a much higher standard deviation means we've got more spread in our data. Explain 1 improvement that could be made to the paranormal belief study, 2 marks. The command word explain requires us to give detail and extension to our response. This question is looking for an improvement, so how could we make this study better? We get 1 mark for identifying our improvement. However, because this is a STEM question, that identification needs to be given in the context of our STEM, in this case, the paranormal belief study. We then need to justify why that is an improvement. Now, we need to be careful here that we don't just go into a weakness of that study. We have to say why that thing that we have done would make this study better. Here's a response. The research team should include researchers from both individualistic and collectivist cultures. so that the questions asked about paranormal beliefs in the interview are not imposing individualistic values about paranormal beliefs. We've identified a particular improvement to this study in that it should have researchers from different cultures, and we've identified different cultures, and that's showing our psychological knowledge. The fact that we've talked about culture is important for this study and shows that we've put this in context. We've returned to our aim and the top of this in our STEM in order to show that we're continually accessing application marks. We've then justified why that is an improvement, that we're not imposing individualistic values about these beliefs. It's important here that we can't just use paranormal beliefs because that is in the question and doesn't show application skills. A psychologist is interested in the development of helping behaviours in children in preschool. They believe that children who are raised by parents who have pro-social professions, such as nursing, are more likely to be pro-social with their peers than children who are raised by parents who have competitive professions, such as a stockbroker. The psychologist collects information about the parent's profession through sending a questionnaire home to 10 local primary schools with a nursery. A series of closed questions are asked, including the critical question of the profession of each parent, which is then coded as pro-social, competitive, or neither. The psychologist then conducts a study with each child to determine whether they were helpful. A child of a similar age, but who wears a different uniform, walks past the child and then drops the books they were carrying on the floor. The psychologist then records whether the preschooler helped to pick up the books or not. Explain one way in which researcher bias could have influenced the validity of the pro-social behaviours study, 2 marks. In this question, we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and extended response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what researcher bias is. This is some way in which the researcher might be influenced towards a certain outcome. Our first mark comes from identification of a way in which they might be biased. Our second mark comes from justifying. This means we need to explain why the thing we have identified is going to affect the validity or the accuracy of this study. Let's have a look at a response. The researcher could be biased in which professions they classify as competitive based on their personal beliefs. The psychologist may believe that a doctor is pro-social, whereas a different psychologist may believe that it is a competitive field to get into, creating subjectivity. We've identified that classification is a way in which researchers might have bias. We've linked this into the STEM, giving context by identifying that the competitiveness of the profession might be the thing that is biased. We're going to tick this off in our STEM to show that we have given context and a range of ideas. We've justified that in terms of subjectivity, and the accuracy of this study is being challenged by the subjective interpretation of careers. We've developed our example of competitive nature and classification through the use of a doctor, of how it might be pro-social or competitive. Table 1 shows the frequency of preschool children who completed a pro-social behaviour based on their parents' profession. Of those children who helped pick up the books, 60 had pro-social parents and 17 had competitive parents. Of those children who didn't help pick up the books, 46 had pro-social parents and 75 had competitive parents. Using research evidence, explain how far realistic conflict theory could account for the findings of the pro-social behaviour study, 6 marks. The command word for this question is explain, so we need to give a detailed and developed answer in order to respond to this command word. It also has some assumed psychological knowledge in terms of realistic conflict theory and that we understand this theory. We need to link these into particular findings that we have been given from our dataset. And all of that needs to apply to this particular study in terms of pro-social behaviours. So we get 3 marks for our AO2, linking those findings into realistic conflict theory, and 3 marks for explaining how far those findings are justifiable using research. Let's have a look at a response. Realistic conflict theory would explain why children with competitive parents have less pro-social behaviours, 17 helping to pick up the books, than those with pro-social behaviours, 60 helping to pick up the books. As those with competitive parents are more likely to see the child in a different uniform as an outgroup and therefore are less likely to be helpful. Sharif et al.'s research supports this conclusion, as they found when competition was used to create friction between the Eagles and the Rattlers, there was less intergroup friendship between the groups, with only 6.4% of Eagles having Rattlers as friends. We've started our response by picking out a finding, and we've compared competitive parents and pro-social parents in terms of the number of children who helped. We've picked out these figures within our response. We've then identified a concept within realistic conflict theory in terms of an outgroup. And we've linked that into one of our conditions of competitive parents, that competitive parents are more likely to see that child as an outgroup. We've then justified this with Sharif et al.'s research, giving specific findings that would support the fact that realistic conflict theory would explain this particular study. We're then going to move on to a new finding. Realistic conflict theory would explain why children with pro-social parents are more likely to help the outgroup child to pick up the book than didn't help pick up the book. As 60 children helped pick up the books compared to 46 who didn't help pick up the books. The children may have been encouraged to have superordinate goals from their parents' careers. Aronson and Bridgman found that the implementation of the jigsaw classroom helped increase academic achievement and reduce prejudicial behaviour. If we return to Table 1, we're now looking at the pro-social behaviours and pro-social parents, and their children's behaviours. So this time we're focusing on findings of the pro-social parents, saying that the pro-social parents are likely to produce children who are more likely to help. We've used figures from the table in order to support this conclusion. We've linked this into terminology from superordinate goals, but we're still talking about the parents' careers in order to link this back into the study. We've supported that with research from Aronson and Bridgman, saying that including superordinate goals is positive and encourages helpful behaviour and less prejudice. Because our question says explain how far, we're actually going to give an alternative strategy that isn't from realistic conflict theory. Social learning theory could be an alternative explanation of the results, with the parents modelling expectations to their children of how to behave, which is replicated by the children within the pro-social behaviour study, explaining why 60 children helped to pick up the books. Bandura et al. 1961 found that same-sex role models are influential for behaviour, as boys were more likely to imitate aggression by a same-sex model. The parent who is the same sex of the child may have more of an influence over behaviour, and whether they have a pro-social profession may encourage the child to help pick up the books. Our alternative theory has come from social learning theory. However, you could do anything as long as it's not realistic conflict theory. We've still looked into this as a result. We've gone for social learning theory here as our alternative, but you could use any theory as long as it's not realistic conflict theory, and you can link it into those findings. This time we've used key terminology from social learning theory in terms of modelling the behaviour, and linked this into the findings that 60 children from the pro-social behaviours category or pro-social parents picked up the books. We've justified this with findings from Bandura et al.'s 1961 study, and again we've said that it's the same-sex parent that might be important in terms of their profession and the helping behaviours of the children. Evaluate how the classic studies of Baddeley 1966b and Rain et al. 1997 show an understanding of how psychological understanding has developed over time, 16 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is slightly sneaky in that we need to both explain and evaluate for this question. There are 6 marks available for our AO1 or our knowledge. Our knowledge can be shown either through our understanding of the debate, development over time, or indeed our understanding of the APFC of our 2 classic studies. Our 10 marks of evaluation come from comparing our classic studies around this particular issue, so making links between our 2 components within the question. This response is going to structure its outline around the issue and debate development over time. Psychology is a relatively new discipline. It has only existed for just over 100 years, and therefore understanding within it has changed and developed over time. Technological advancements have been significant in the development of psychological knowledge. We've identified the nature of psychology as a new discipline, and we've identified a particular characteristic that has helped its development in terms of technology. We're going to look at one of the scanning techniques, and we're going to talk about PET scans because that links into Rain et al. As our classic study. PET scans have been enabled by the development of technology to allow a radioactive tracer to be injected that dissolves in the bloodstream. The tracer is carried by the blood to the brain, where it concentrates around brain structures that are particularly active. A PET scan detects the radioactivity and converts it into a digital image of the brain, highlighting the active areas in yellow and red. We've clearly identified a range of knowledge about PET scans as a new scanning technique, talking about its role as a radioactive tracer and how it works in terms of understanding the connectivity in the brain. We're then going to explain this technological development in terms of our classic study. Rain et al.'s use of PET scans showed that NGRIs had significantly lower glucose metabolism in the left amygdala and higher in the right amygdala than controls. The findings support that violent offenders have significantly different brain activity. The development of the PET scans allowed Rain et al. To study live brains and enabled repeated scans of the participants. We've given clear findings from Rain et al. In order to show our psychological knowledge and explain the impact of it. We've also said that this benefits psychology by being able to study live brains rather than post-mortems that have been used historically. We're then going to compare this to Baddeley. However, Baddeley used a laboratory experiment, a long-established research method that continues to be used within psychological research. The use of laboratory experiments allows for high levels of control, ensuring internal reliability between participants, who were all showed the word lists by slide projector for 3 seconds, and each were allowed 1 minute to write out the 10-word sequence, enabling cause and effect to be determined. Our counter-argument in this issue and debate is things that have stayed the same, such as the use of laboratory experiments. We need to explain why they have continued to be used, giving strengths of this particular research method, and we've looked at reliability. We've linked this into Baddeley's particular study by giving some details of the standardised procedure. Now, this may depend on whether you're doing experiment 1, 2 or 3. We've looked at experiment 3 for Baddeley, but some of the details might be slightly different for experiment 1. And then we're going to give a judgment about the impact of this part of technology. We're then going to give a judgment about whether psychology has developed over time. The significant developments in technology has enabled psychology to investigate behaviours in different ways and secure new insights. Where we're talking about new insights, this is a real endeavour and benefit from technological advancements, showing that psychology has changed over time. We're then going to explain another way that psychology has developed. The scientific process to psychology involves the development of theories and explanation, which has been evident from both Baddeley and Rain's studies. Theoretical development is another way in which psychology has developed over time. We're then going to make a point in order to identify how theories and approaches have developed. The development of the cognitive approach, focusing on internal processing, had many psychologists focusing on memory, moving away from learning theories which had come before it and focused on external observable behaviours. We've identified the chronology of approaches, with learning theories coming before cognitive approach. We're explaining why cognitive approach is a development and showing that it is focused on internal processes rather than observable behaviours which came before it. We're then going to explain this in terms of the context of Baddeley's study. Baddeley's research into encoding in long-term memory was in line with a growing number of psychologists investigating memory. His research enabled the development of the multi-store model, demonstrating that short-term memory and long-term memory were distinct different ways of processing. In our link between cognitive approach and Baddeley, we've shown that Baddeley was one of a number of psychologists all investigating memory. However, we've shown the impact of his knowledge in terms of developing and changing the multi-store model, adding ideas about encoding. We're then going to make a comparison with Rain et al. However, Rain et al. Study continued the study of the role of brain structures into aggression and developed the understanding of the role of the limbic system that had begun in 1937 by Papez. Rain et al., however, gave new insights, with NGRIs having low metabolism in both the PFC and amygdala, demonstrating that activity within regions of the brain, as well as structural differences from tumours, were responsible for aggression. We've got a counter-argument in here, and how Rain et al. Study is showing a continued focus on brain structures into aggression. So this is a behaviour that's been looked at for a long period of time. However, we've shown how Rain is a development of this, understanding both the role of the amygdala and the PFC, talking about activity as well as structural differences that we already knew about. And then we're going to form a judgment about this area of development of psychology. Both Baddeley and Rain et al. Demonstrate the cumulative nature of psychological research, where researchers' knowledge builds on and contributes to other psychologists. We've illustrated our wider psychological knowledge here in the idea of cumulative knowledge, that it builds over time, with one psychologist or later psychologists developing the work of earlier psychologists. We're then going to identify another way that psychology has developed over time. Psychology does not operate in isolation, but reflects the interests and concerns of society at the time. The social context is really important in psychology in terms of directing which behaviours should be the focus of psychological research. We're going to start with how this links into the cognitive approach. The development of computers during the 1960s and 70s meant that the computer analogy had a significant influence on psychologists. So here we're talking about the wider development of computers and how this particularly shapes the way we're talking about memory and the terminology that we're using. It's time to focus this on Baddeley's classic study now. Baddeley's focus on encoding, a term associated with computers, demonstrates the impact of the social climate when he conducted his research. The focus on memory, as similar internal processes for both computers and the human brain, also widely influenced psychologists during this period. So we've talked about how encoding is both similar for computers and the human brain. The focus on these internal processes have been helpful in our understanding. We're then going to compare this with Rain et al. Study. Rain et al.'s focus on aggression as a human behaviour was not new. The study of aggression in both humans and animals has long been established, with evolutionary theories of aggression having been established in the early 20th century. Rain et al.'s research into aggression does offer new insights, but also demonstrates psychology's fascination with destructive behaviours. So we've clearly elaborated with a counter-argument here, showing that aggression has been studied for a long period of time, and we've started with evolutionary theories. We have suggested, though, that this particular classic study offers new insights, which does show an element of development in psychological research. And now it's time to give a judgment once again. Baddeley and other cognitive psychologists' focus on memory reflects broader sociological advancement, whereas the continued and sustained focus on explaining aggression shows that some human behaviours are revisited by psychologists. Our judgment suggests that cognitive psychologists in the work of Baddeley is more of a development on psychological understanding and looking at new behaviours, rather than Rain et al., which is continuing to look at aggression. And then we're going to identify another way in which we can talk about research and the development over time. The findings of classic studies are still relevant to society, demonstrating the influence of research over time. Here we're talking about findings and our application of our particular classic studies as part of a grave evaluation. Both Baddeley and Rain et al.'s findings have a significant contribution to society. So again, we're talking about application and how these results have applied and given an application and contribution to changing social behaviours. Baddeley's research continues to have a significant impact for students revising for exams. Students' focus on reorganising information and relating topics to other material is significant for long-term recall rather than just repeating material. Our application focus for Baddeley is about revision strategies. We're also going to explain the application of Rain et al.'s results. Furthermore, Rain et al.'s research have social implications for reducing aggression by changing biological structure through medication, surgery, or environmental changes to increase the activity in the PFC. Here we focused on social applications and increasing the activity in the prefrontal cortex. The continued influence of these classic studies demonstrates that psychology continues to develop. So again, we're making a little judgment here, and we're saying although these are classic studies, they show the development of psychology over time and they are still influential. It's time to form a final conclusion. Technology has had a significant impact on psychology. Technology has had a significant impact on psychology developing and has offered new insights into human behaviour. The continued focus on particular behaviours and research methods shows that psychology has stayed the same. Social context and topical behaviours has shaped the direction of psychology. The influence of computers had a significant impact on Baddeley's research into memory and the focus on encoding. The significant and continued applications of Baddeley and Rain et al. Demonstrate that findings continue to have an impact on behaviour. Sleep is an important behaviour for all animals, although the amount of sleep varies based on their species. Sleep can be a way for animals to conserve energy, with smaller animals with lower metabolic rates sleeping more than larger animals. Alternatively, the amount of sleep that animals get could be a learnt behaviour to avoid predators. When they are prey, they must sleep less in order to avoid the danger from predators. Research has also found that the amount of sleep is determined by the amount of time needed to forage for food. Herbivores spend their time eating plants that are poor in nutrients and so must spend more time eating and less time sleeping. Evaluate the extent to which behaviour, such as sleep, can be explained by learning theories. You must make reference to the context in your answer, 12 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate. However, this is a sneaky command word because we need to explain as well. There are 4 marks available for our knowledge in this question, and our knowledge needs to focus on different learning theories, giving a detailed explanation of a range of learning theories. We then also have some application marks, and these all need to link into sleep. So we have the same amount of marks for application. How do these learning theories apply to sleep specifically? We also have 4 marks available for our evaluation. That's giving strengths and weaknesses of learning theories. Now, you don't need to know specific research for sleep because this could change. So we're talking more about research that supports or criticises different learning theories. We can also pick up AO3 marks by offering an alternative explanation for sleep that isn't based in learning theories. Let's have a look at our response. Classical conditioning explains that behaviours are learnt through association. A neutral stimulus produces no response, and an unconditioned stimulus produces a natural reflex. To create a conditioned response, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together over a period of time until the neutral stimulus produces the response without the unconditioned stimulus. At this point, it becomes a conditioned stimulus producing a conditioned response. We've got a broad range of terminology included here to explain how learning is through an association. It's really important that we include that a neutral stimulus produces no response and an unconditioned stimulus produces a natural response. We want to go through this process of before conditioning, during conditioning and after conditioning in order to give a complete response about classical conditioning. We're then going to move through and look at application. Research supports that learning is created by association in both humans and animals, so sleep has been associated with a greater likelihood of being attacked by predators, and so prey sleep less. We've got a clear link into the stem here with sleep, and we've looked at the association between being attacked by predators, and so prey sleep less. We're going to tick this off in our stem in order to show a broad range of application and that we've already used this part of the stem in order to apply our knowledge. Let's move through to some research to support the role of classical conditioning. Pavlov found that dogs learn to salivate a natural response to the unfamiliar sound of the bell. Watson and Rayner found that fear could be conditioned through association. Little Albert learnt to have a phobia of white fluffy objects through the systematic pairing of a rat with a loud noise. We've got research findings from a range of research here, from Pavlov and from Watson and Rayner, to support that learning is through association. We're going to counteract this now, giving a counter-argument of an alternative that might explain sleep. However, sleep patterns may also be the result of biological mechanisms such as hormones. Melatonin is produced to initiate sleep, and increasing or decreasing levels may be triggered by sunlight. So our alternative here comes from hormones. We've gone for a specific hormone related to sleep, which is melatonin. However, we might know some other ones like adrenaline as a response to threat, which might be more similar with our syllabus. We're going to come to a judgment about the role of classical conditioning. Associations of when to sleep may reflect hormonal fluctuations in the body. So we've actually gone for a bit of an interactionist approach here, saying that these two things are combined together. It's time to look at a different learning theory now. Operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when a reward is added to encourage behaviour, whereas negative reinforcement is when an unpleasant feeling is removed by the behaviour. Behaviours are also changed by punishment, with positive punishment adding something to stop the behaviour, and negative punishment something being taken away to stop or prevent the behaviour. We've talked about a range of terminology here in order to understand and explain that operant conditioning is through reinforcement. Be careful about the difference between negative reinforcement and our different types of punishment. Whenever we're talking about reinforcement, we're saying we're doing things to encourage behaviours, either adding or removing things. Punishment is things to stop the behaviour. And then we're going to link this into sleep. Research supports that learning is created by reinforcement in both humans and animals, with those animals sleeping less having more time to forage for food. Here we've linked this into sleep by talking about having less sleep in order for more time to eat. This is a type of negative reinforcement, that by not doing a behaviour, not sleeping, we've got more positive in reinforcement in terms of more access to food. We've gone back up to our stem here to tick this part of our stem off, because we've linked that still into operant conditioning and learning theories. We're then going to use research to evaluate operant conditioning. Skinner encouraged rats to pull a lever by presenting them with a food pellet each time the lever was pulled. Latham and Dossip found that variable ratio pay encouraged beaver trappers to catch more beavers. Again, we focused on research findings in order to use our research for operant conditioning to evaluate. Be really careful, especially with Pavlov and Skinner, not to go into a big description about how that research was conducted, but what are the findings and how does that support our particular learning theory? We're going to give a counter-argument now and explain a problem with operant conditioning. Operant conditioning fails to take into account the role of motivation in explaining human behaviour. Sleep patterns may be different in human beings because they are motivated to stay awake at night despite the benefits of sleep and biological mechanisms encouraging sleep. A general problem with operant conditioning is that it fails to take into account motivation. We've linked this specifically back into sleep, and that we might be motivated to stay awake at night despite the benefits, particularly if we're a human being. You might want to give a specific example here, but we want to be careful not to go too far away from animals, which is the focus of our STEM. And then we're going to come to a judgment. Operant conditioning may explain the sleep patterns of animals better than those of humans, as many people suffer from sleep disorders. We've come to quite a sensitive judgment here, in that we're saying that it might be better for animals rather than humans. So although it is an explanation of sleep, it's not really generalisable. Let's look at a final learning theory. Social learning theory suggests that behaviour is learnt through observation of role models that have power and status. Attention is paid to their behaviour, which is then retained by the observer. Reproduction of the behaviour may change depending on the appropriate situation, and motivation is due to vicarious reinforcement. We've discussed a range of terminology for social learning theory, focusing on the processes of social learning through attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. However, you could absolutely talk about imitation, observation, role models, and vicarious reinforcement in a bit more detail instead. It's time to link this back into sleep. Animals have learnt sleep patterns from role models who lead the pack as they are viewed as having successful strategies. These are then reproduced by the rest of the herd so that you have differing patterns between smaller and larger animals. So we've identified that the leader of the pack would be the role model for animals, and that we've also identified that the rest of the herd would likely to copy the pack leader. We've linked this in to our stem and the difference between larger and smaller animals. We've returned to our stem in order to tick this part off, that we have a difference between the smaller animals with lower metabolic rates sleeping more than larger animals. It's now time to evaluate social learning theory. There is empiricism for the role of social learning theory in encouraging behaviours and resolves the issue of motivation with other learning theories. Bandura et al. 1961 found that children who observed an aggressive role model were more likely to be aggressive. Same-sex role models were found to have more significant impact on the aggressive behaviour of boys. Again, we've talked about the role of motivation here, and we've used our research evidence. We've focused on Bandura, and again, it's really important that we focus on specific findings, so about same-sex role models and the aggressive role model, rather than giving a description of that procedure. It's time to give a counter-argument now to elaborate in our evaluation. However, cultural variations in sleep patterns may be due to evolutionary adaptations to our environment. Countries that have a siesta are often hot during the middle of the day, and sleeping during this period could save energy and resources. We've used counter-argument for cultural variations, and we've said that this might have an evolutionary advantage, so giving a counterpoint to learning theories. We've used our example of a siesta here, however you could use something else that might be more appropriate. And then we're going to come to a judgment. Cultural variations in sleep patterns shows variation and vicarious reinforcement of norms demonstrating the impact of environmental influences. Where we're talking about the role of norms, we're talking about social rules in behaviour. We've linked that back into social learning theory once again by saying that certain norms are encouraged by others. We're then going to give a final counter-argument discussing a different theory. Evolutionary theories suggest that behaviour has adapted in order to ensure the survival of the species, which is known as natural selection. They also suggest that behaviours are based on sexual selection and the encouragement of mate retention and mate competition. We've identified a theory outside of learning theories. It doesn't matter which we go for, we've just gone for evolutionary theories. We've shown a clear understanding of key terminology within this alternative approach. We're then going to link this into sleep. Herbivores sleeping less will help them survive as they have more time to spend eating to ensure that they have enough nutrients to survive and procreate. We've talked about the difference here with herbivores, saying that they spend more time eating in order to have enough nutrients to survive. We've returned to our stem to tick this off in order to show our varied responses and application. We're then going to evaluate evolutionary theories. Cross-cultural research can support evolutionary theories, showing that similar patterns of behaviour are universal. Buss found evidence that preferences in mate choice, with males preferring younger and more attractive women. The universal nature of sleep patterns, with predators having more sleep than prey, supports that the nature of sleep may be an adaptive trait. We've given specific research that shows that behaviours is universal through Buss. As I said before, our research support doesn't have to link into the behaviour because we know that that's a real unknown from the exam board. However, we have linked this back into sleep in terms of talking about the sleep patterns of predators, and those are universal. It's time to give a counter-argument. However, evolutionary explanations do not take into account the role of culture and that some cultures may have distinct sleep patterns. There are also some prey that sleep as much as predators, such as rabbits. Cultural variations is a great way to evaluate evolutionary explanations. If things are different in different cultures, then they're suggesting that they're not universal and adaptive. It's time to give a judgment now, comparing our alternative to learning theories. The variation of sleep patterns between predators and prey shows that evolution may be a better explanation than learning theories. It's good to be definitive in our judgments to show that we've really assessed the nature of the theories that we've presented. We're now going to form a final conclusion. evidence from research with both humans and animals supports that behaviours such as sleep can be learnt. Differences between prey and predators supports an evolutionary explanation for sleep, with differences in sleep being adaptive. Biological differences in hormone levels during the night suggest that physiological differences may encourage sleep at certain points of the day or night. And finally, other factors such as age or cultural expectations may have an impact on sleep patterns. Assess the use of psychological knowledge in society, 20 marks. Here we have the command word assess. This means we still need to explain and evaluate. The major difference with an assess question is that we want to form a final judgment or a range of judgments throughout our response. We have 8 marks of our knowledge, and our knowledge is coming from our understanding of the use of psychological knowledge. We have 12 marks of evaluation, how that psychological knowledge has been used to benefit society or maybe has been problematic for society. In our 20 marker, in our final issues and debates question, we can use all examples across psychology. So although we've got examples that we've used in our essay, you can always use substitutions and alternatives in your own response. Let's have a look at an essay. Psychological understanding should help people to avoid or overcome difficulties. In understanding human behaviour, psychology has the ability to unlearn behaviour, create more rational thought processes, make changes to physiology to vary levels of neurotransmitters and hormones, or make changes to social surroundings that in turn has an impact on behaviour. We've identified a specific use for psychological knowledge in terms of overcoming or avoiding difficulties. We've then linked this in to a range of different approaches within psychology. We're going to identify now and look at our evaluation. Psychological therapies are effective in treating phobias by learning a different response to a stimulus based on reciprocal inhibition. We've started by identifying therapies generally and then gone into a specific one in terms of learning theories. We've shown our psychological knowledge here by using key terminology in terms of reciprocal inhibition. We're then going to use research to explain why we're saying that it's effective. Gilroy et al. Compared patients who received systematic desensitisation with a control group for a phobia of spiders. At 3 and 33 months later, those receiving systematic desensitisation were less fearful. We've given clear findings from specific research, showing detail in our psychological knowledge. And then we're going to give a counter-argument, also looking at therapies. However, therapies developed to treat schizophrenia are not without side effects that can be harmful to patients. Hill found that large out-of-court settlements have been made for tardive dyskinesia, the uncontrollable movements of lips, tongue, faces, hands and feet, affects 30% of patients, with 75% of conditions being irreversible. We've identified that not all psychological knowledge is useful and that therapies have side effects. We've taken ours from clinical psychology in schizophrenia, talking about the impact of tardive dyskinesia when taking antipsychotics. And then we're going to give a judgment to assess the use of psychological knowledge. Therapies do improve the symptoms of clinical conditions, and the subjective reporting from patients demonstrates that psychology has been used positively in society. We've linked this directly back to the question, in terms of it being a positive use of psychological knowledge, and that therapies are effective in terms of improving symptoms of clinical conditions. Again, you could have gone for other clinical conditions here or any therapy. And then we're going to return to explaining the use of psychological knowledge more generally. The applications of psychological knowledge can be overt, with members of society being aware that psychological techniques are being applied and still be positive. Although they are openly acknowledged, we can also be unaware of their impact or dismiss their influence on our behaviour. Here we're talking about the nature of psychological applications being overt or being known to the public. However, we're still saying these are positive and we might be unaware of their impact. So although they aren't hiding that we're trying to change behaviour, we might not necessarily acknowledge that they actually are changing our behaviour. We're then going to evaluate this with particular techniques from research. through the work of Sharif et al. And his findings in the Robbers Cave study that prejudice can be created through competition, techniques have been developed to reduce prejudice in society through superordinate goals. We've identified the work of Sharif and the Robbers Cave study. Because we're using this for application, we're not going to go into a massive detail about the findings or procedure of this particular study. We've said that this has helped us develop techniques to reduce prejudice, having a positive application in society through including superordinate goals. We're then going to give an example from research about how this has been conducted. You could use a popular example in society instead to still show the same effect. Aronson and Bridgman developed the Jigsaw Classroom to reduce racial prejudice in American schools, where students had to work together and take responsibility for different parts of a group project. The technique increased out-group empathy and improved the academic performance for minority students. We've given detail about our particular research example. It's really important here we've said the impact of this positively in society, in terms of out-group empathy and academic performance. We're then going to give a counter-argument about how applications of psychological knowledge haven't been so positive. However, understanding of obedience has been used to justify destructive behaviours for society. Binding factors reduce moral strain and uniform increases anonymity so that people are more likely to act aggressively, which has been shown in the level of police brutality and the lack of convictions in the USA, as you are 3 times more likely to be killed by police if you are coloured, and 99% of police killings result in no charge. We've taken our example from binding factors. Our examples here come from a key question, so you could use your key questions to show our applications of psychological knowledge to contemporary issues. It's time for another judgment about the use of psychological knowledge. Having knowledge about how prejudice and obedience can be increased can be manipulated by those in power to encourage the destructive behaviour of others, demonstrating that psychological understanding isn't always positive. We've been clear in our judgment here about how psychological knowledge hasn't been used positively. Specifically, we've talked about the manipulation of knowledge by those in power. We're going to return back to explaining different ways in which psychological knowledge can be applied. There have been abusive applications of psychological techniques to control specific groups in society and ensure that stigma remains around some clinical conditions, making it more difficult for individuals to access support. Here we've explained how psychological knowledge might be used for a negative consequence for society and control specific groups. A link to stigma is nice in order to demonstrate these negative connotations around psychological knowledge. We're then going to evaluate this with specific examples. Psychology does not operate in isolation. It can be manipulated by those in power to further their own goals. We're linking this in a little bit to social control and how this manipulation of our knowledge could have negative connotations. There's lots of different examples you can use here, but we've actually stuck with clinical psychology for this one. Those who breach social norms or challenge government policies can be labelled as mentally disturbed. The KGB in Russia pressurised psychiatrists in the 1960s to diagnose and institutionalise political opponents. We've clearly discussed the impact of this in terms of those who breach social norms. Again, we've talked about a specific example to illustrate our psychological knowledge. We're going to elaborate by continuing this idea about labelling certain people. The labels given to individuals can create a self-fulfilling prophecy and enhance their behaviour. Jehoda found that the Kwaku, Wednesday boys of the Ashanti tribe, were 3 times more likely to be involved in violent crime because they were labelled as aggressive and volatile. Schizophrenics are portrayed as dangerous by the media, but are not actually more dangerous according to Fazal et al. We've given findings from 2 different pieces of research here, from criminal and clinical psychology, in order to illustrate how labelling might be a self-fulfilling prophecy that is a negative connotation and a negative use of psychological knowledge. We're then going to form a final judgment about the role of labelling. Media campaigns to reduce stigma, like Boys Cry Too, have been designed to challenge social norms around mental health. However, those in power still have coercive power to determine which behaviours are labelled as dangerous. Our judgment here is kind of sitting on the fence. We've said that it has been positive, and understanding this has enabled us to challenge those media and stereotypes. However, we've still gone back to this idea of coercive power, showing our psychological knowledge and terminology in relation to other issues and debates. We're going to explain the use of psychological knowledge in a slightly different way. Psychology has a duty to research pressing social problems or problematic behaviours reflecting the needs of contemporary society. The nature of psychological theories and research is to be of use for society. In this explanation of the use of psychological knowledge, we're saying that it's the very foundation of psychology to be useful and to understand pressing social issues. It is a primary goal for psychology in order to reflect and be useful. Our explanation of this is going to come from our use of key questions, which means that this might be very different for you in your setting and the key questions that you have chosen to use. In the UK, we have an ageing population, making the need for research about memory and Alzheimer's a focus for psychology. The Alzheimer's Society suggests that by 2025, 1 million people will be living with dementia in the UK, and that 1 in 3 aged 65 or over will die of dementia. Here we've identified the role of an ageing population in shaping psychological knowledge, in that this has been a foundation and a focus for memory research. We're going to elaborate further on why this is such a critical issue in contemporary society. Not only is dementia costly to society in terms of price, but it is also a debilitating and frustrating disease. Atkinson and Schifrin suggest that memory has to be rehearsed in short-term memory before it can enter long-term memory. People with dementia may forget what has just been said to them, as they haven't rehearsed it properly in short-term memory, and hence it has not been properly encoded. Using specific questions, such as "Has your daughter Mary come to visit you today?" may help cue memories. We've linked the impact of dementia back into our psychological knowledge, and here we're talking about Atkinson and Schifrin and the multi-stool model. We've used this to give strategies of how we might help people with dementia, and again, you might use different examples here, which is absolutely fine. We're going to give a counter-argument here, talking about how our understanding of memory may have not been used positively in society. However, an understanding of memory can also be manipulated and be used negatively in society. Leading questions and the manipulation of schema about people can be used to encourage prejudice or label individuals within society as criminal. We've given a counter-argument here in terms of leading questions, suggesting that actually we might also use this knowledge of memory in order to negatively affect society. We're going to return to this idea and make a judgment about psychology reflecting the needs of society. As the needs of society change, so does the focus for psychological research, from how we learn behaviours to candidate gene association studies as our knowledge of the human genome has developed. Here our judgment suggests that actually psychological knowledge is focused on being useful and changes depending on the needs of society. The focus on psychology being useful has then had some impacts in the level of control and power psychologists have. The impact of psychological knowledge has invested psychologists with expert power and a significant knowledge about human behaviour, which is often trusted. Here we've talked about the implications for this, the use of expert power, and the fact that our knowledge as psychologists and our status as psychologists in being useful is then trusted. We're then going to evaluate this. Due to expert power, the opinions of clinicians is respected and their directions for treatment is followed by patients. We've integrated our knowledge of expert power into the role of clinicians, and we're going to explain this in more detail. Clinicians have the power to determine which thought processes are viewed as rational or irrational. They also have the power to determine the dosage of chemotherapies and which medication an individual should be put on. Clinicians also have the power to diagnose someone with a disorder or not, and therefore impact whether they have access to treatment at all. We've used a wide range of examples here to show different aspects of clinical knowledge, talking about cognitive psychology, biological psychology, and diagnosis from clinical psychology. We're going to counter this now in talking about individuals and their own free will, and therefore that it's not just a one-way process of psychology being useful, it's how people engage with it. Not all therapies are directive. Many involve the patient, as they will be responsible for continuing to action it. The patient is responsible for continuing to take their medication, engage in the behavioural activation within CBT, or the development of their desensitisation hierarchy. Here we're using our understanding of the directive nature of some therapies. When we're saying it's directive, we're saying that the psychologist or the psychiatrist is in control and the patient isn't. Whereas if we're saying it's not directive, we're saying they have some autonomy on that behaviour. We've linked this in and showed a broad range of psychological knowledge here, including terminology about behavioural activation events, so this would be homework or things to go away and do, and a desensitisation hierarchy in terms of a scale of fears from the least fearful to the most fearful. We're going to make a judgment now about our role within how useful psychological knowledge is. Those within psychological knowledge must recognise their power and their own biases so that they are recognised and reduced so as not to affect the validity of findings, theories, diagnosis or treatment. Here we've talked about a limitation of the use of psychological knowledge in terms of psychologists and their subjectivity and biases. It's time to come to a final conclusion. Psychological knowledge has ensured the development of a range of therapies from each psychological approach, making it of significant use for society. Psychological knowledge has been used to harm society and specific groups, and therefore is not inherently positive. What is researched is shaped by society and social problems to ensure that the findings have useful applications to make change. Psychology has a duty to ensure that the knowledge created is of use to society. Psychologists must be aware of their own biases in order to ensure that the psychological knowledge is accurate and in order to be of use in society. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.